Перед тем, как мы перейдем, собственно, к разговору о еврейских танцах, я хотел бы просто кратко попытаться сформулировать, что из себя представляет еврейская музыка, что из себя представляет еврейская музыкальная культура. Если мы говорим именно о инструментальной еврейской музыке, которую, собственно, и принято называть сегодня клезмером, то, в принципе, если кратко, то это традиционная танцевальная свадебная музыка евреев, ашкеназов, то есть восточноевропейских евреев. Наибольшее распространение эта музыка получила на южных границах Российской империи, как в Украине, в Бессарабии, то есть сегодняшней Молдавии и Румынии, в Белоруссии и так далее. Существовало огромное количество различных мелодий в еврейской музыке, которые предназначались совершенно для разных мероприятий, для разных церемоний. Такие, как, например, совершенно не предназначенные для танцев мелодии, как «Калебазецен». Это церемония, когда во время еврейской свадьбы невеста должна быть усажена в большое кресло, ей закрывали лицо, которое жених, соответственно, мог увидеть уже только после момента, когда они становились официальным мужем и женой. Были мелодии, рассчитанные, собственно, на танцы, когда уже вся официальная часть хупы была завершена. Были многочисленные марши, когда процессия свадебная передвигалась, допустим, от дома невесты или от дома жениха к синагоге или к месту вообще, где происходила хупа. Были мелодии, рассчитанные только на слушание, которые в основном игрались во время трапезы и, соответственно, как правило, не были очень танцевальными, не обладали большим высоким темпом. Соответственно, и сами танцы имели самое разное предназначение и самый разный смысл и информационный посыл. Например, во время свадьбы достаточно распространен и любим был евреями такой танец, как брогерстанц. Этот танец обычно исполнялся двумя женщинами, а именно матерями, то есть тещей и свекровью. И этот танец всегда имел немножко ироничный характер, поскольку каждая из матерей в каком-то плане представляла свою партнершу по этому танцу некоторого, недостаточно хорошей для ее дитя. И, соответственно, какой-то шел не то чтобы негативный, но немножко провоцирующий посыл в этих танцах. Были также танцы, которые были рассчитаны на только сепаратные танцы, то есть я имею в виду для те танцы, которые танцевались только мужчинами или только женщинами, или же одни и те же танцы, где просто все танцевали отдельно. Надо сказать, что совместные танцы, когда мужчины и женщины танцуют вместе, появились, в принципе, только совсем недолгое время назад. В основном эта культура началась в Америке, естественно, в том числе среди реформистских евреев, поскольку, в принципе, если речь идет о танцах среди религиозных, ортодоксальных евреев, то там в лучшем случае, если речь идет о танце жениха и невесты, то, как правило, они во время танца не держатся за руки напрямую, а используют для этого платок. То есть жених держится за платок с одной стороны и невеста с другой. Надо сказать, что платок вообще в традиционных еврейских, и вообще не только еврейских, но и народных танцах играет достаточно значительную роль, поскольку схожую традицию мы можем проследить, например, в таких танцах, как молдавская переница. Если кто-нибудь слышал про этот танец, если нет, я вкратце расскажу. Во время переницы молодые люди могли показать друг другу, условно говоря, кто кому в этом селе нравится. Как это делалось? Существовал некий круг. Во время танца в центр круга с достаточно большим платком выходил кто-либо из танцующих, неважно, будь то молодой человек или девушка. Некоторое время он танцевал в гордом одиночестве, или она танцевала в гордом одиночестве в центре круга. После чего выбирался из круга танцующих кто-либо. Обычно выхватывался он в центр накидыванием платка на шею. Некоторое время эта пара танцевала, после чего платок расстилался по полу, люди становились на колени напротив друг друга, обменивались двумя-тремя короткими поцелуями, после чего выбранный оставался в центре один, и дальше продолжалось до тех пор, пока народ не уставал танцевать. Схожая традиция с платком появилась в еврейских танцах несколько позже, но в куда более целомудренном варианте, то есть максимально, что держались через платок танцора. Были танцы, рассчитанные на более молодую публику, такие, например, как фрейлахс, такие как булгар. Были танцы, рассчитанные на публику более пожилую, такие, например, как хусидл или хосидл, зависит от происхождения. Этот танец был достаточно медленным, двудольным. Были танцы, рассчитанные изначально исключительно на женщин, и только в более поздние времена ставшие, грубо говоря, унисекс. Используя их, то есть в наши дни их танцуют все, и этот танец, кстати, мы сегодня будем учить во время практической части. Этот танец назывался хора. Хора в еврейском понимании, в понимании еврейской музыки, это всегда сравнительно медленный трехдольный танец, хотя танец с абсолютно таким же названием существует также и в молдавской, и в румынской, и в сербской, и даже и в том числе в израильской музыкальной культуре, с той только разницей, что если в молдавской и румынской музыке этот танец может иметь как трехдольный, так и двудольный темп, а в случае с израильской музыкой исключительно темп двудольный и очень быстрый, то хор это всегда либо медленный, либо средний темп и трехдольный размер. Большое очень значение в еврейских танцах имело не только какие-то определенные движения, какие-то шаги, но и всегда это был очень-очень важный посыл с точки зрения жестов. То есть очень активно, как при танцах, так и, собственно, в повседневной речи, евреи использовали жесты. Я сейчас предложил бы Алану несколько дополнить именно то, что я сейчас начал говорить про жесты. Alan, würdest du jetzt noch ein bisschen über die Gestik in jiddische Tänze machen?
Okay, good evening. First of all, I have to tell you, I am not a dance historian. I'm an artist, and I've been working with musicians and dancers and sociologists and ethnographers for about 30 years now. So I learned something in this time, but this is still different from sitting here and telling you I'm a dance historian. So I'd like to tell you some things that I understand, or let's say I think I understand, but many of these things I think are still open to discussion and debate, because really we have very little sources for knowing very much about Yiddish dancing. But we're talking first of all about social dancing. That's very important to say. On the other hand, for most of Yiddish history, a religious understanding of life, you could say, was also part of daily life. So even though this is social dancing and not religious dancing, we find the sensibility of religious expression inside of the social dancing. The dances that I know of as Yiddish dances all exist also in other cultures. Mark will teach you some of those dances later. Some of them have a form that now we know of as, we might say that it's only a Yiddish dance, for example, the share. But if you're familiar with the larger world of folk dances, you would say, oh, well, the share is one example of a square dance, or a contra dance. So we have these kinds of dances. We have square or contra dances, dances in figures. We have dances in circles. We have dances in couples. And we have solo dancing. And what makes these dances especially Yiddish is not the steps, but it's the way of doing them. It's the style. So for many hundreds of years, Jewish boys studied in Cheder. From the beginning, they learned to read along with melodies. And from the beginning, the kind of learning was like a discussion, with things like asking questions, expressing doubts. This is what we do when we have a discussion. And there's a vocabulary of gestures that goes along with this. What are those gestures? So last night I talked about the fact that we see cartoons or we see drawings of these gestures in anti-Semitic writings, especially from the 19th century and the early 20th century. Because those gestures were the sign of Jewish difference. Now, in the Nazi period, the Nazi propagandists claimed that these gestures are inherited racially by Jews, and that because it's biological, these gestures set apart Jews from other people forever. In 1942, an American scholar named David Ephron did a very interesting study. He made films of Eastern European traditional Jews talking to each other in the street. I want you to notice that when I said talking to each other in the street, I did this. And he found that there was a very rich vocabulary of gestures among these traditional Eastern European Jews, but that one generation later, under the pressure of assimilation in America, most of those gestures were lost. So on the one hand, this is an answer to the Nazi propaganda, because it says, well, there is a language of gesture, but it's not biological, it's cultural. But for those of us like myself who are interested in understanding the deep style questions of Yiddish culture, this catalog of gestures is like a treasure for us. And the question is, what are these gestures? What kind of gestures are they? So they are not gestures what we call referential gestures. They don't make pictures. For example, it's not a gesture like a small mouse, or a big man. If I do those gestures, you probably think, well, it doesn't look like Jewish gestures at all, because Yiddish gestures are not pictorial. Yiddish gestures are logical and rhetorical. For example, I would say, Yiddish gestures are not pictorial, they're logical. Or, two people are speaking to each other. We go on with the conversation. Stop. In fact, he shows a very interesting Ephron that when Eastern European Jews are speaking to each other and they want them to stop speaking, they grab the hand. If we consider this general category of gesture as a kind of a gesture of rhetoric, a language of rhetorical gesture, and then we look at this vis-a-vis the question of what makes a Yiddish dance Yiddish, this helps us understand the answer. Because actually Yiddish dances have very little to do with the steps. There are really only one or two steps. There are only a few rhythms. It's not like Bulgarian dancing where something is in 7 and something is in 11 and something is in 25. It's not like that. We don't do a lot with our hips. In fact, the feet up to the hips are really there to carry the upper body around the room. And what we do with the upper body is we communicate with the people around us. We do this with our eyes, we do it with our head position. There's a very big difference between this and this. We do it with the position of our arms. My understanding of Yiddish dancing is that these gestures, which are partly natural and partly have their history in Talmudic kind of disputation, that these gestures are used to improvise communication with the other people that you dance with. For example, we have the share. Now, the share has 4 couples, and it's a very typical kind of contra dance. Each man dances with every woman. Each woman dances with every man. It's a long dance. And you dance with your partner. You go into the middle and you do a solo. You go back to your partner. You go to someone else. You go back to the middle. You go back to the partner. Each one of these is a different social situation. It's called shining when you go into the middle. And when you do this dance, and you're doing it quite freely, each position is a different relational event. I'm back with my partner. Hello. I'm in the middle of the circle. I'm very happy to be here. 20 of the people here are my children or grandchildren. I go to my neighbor who I met once before in my life. And to this person I say, hello. But now maybe I'm dancing with this person that I know very well. And with that person, it's a completely different gesture that I'm using. So for me, the essence of Yiddish dancing is whatever the steps are, if you want, they're an excuse for the social interaction. Again, we're speaking about social dancing. Okay, now, this is the most important thing that I have to tell you. But just to give you a little bit more round picture, I want to say that especially in the 19th century, but also the 20th century, that wherever Jews have lived in other cultures, they also loved doing the dances of those other cultures. So in many Jewish weddings or in many Jewish family events or parties, in addition to these, what we think of as more typical Yiddish dancing, you will also find Russian social dancing, and you would find waltzes, and you would find really all of the dances that are popular in the world, nevertheless done with a, let's call it, Yiddish sensibility. The other thing I want to say is that, you know, we sort of have the impression, many of us today, that culture is becoming more and more liberal. But what we know about Yiddish history, about the history of Yiddish culture, is that actually there have been waves of more liberal and more conservative, for example, concerning the relationships between men and women, for many hundreds of years. And for example, now this very strict separation of the sexes among Orthodox is a quite conservative, reactionary point of view. Even the handkerchief between the sexes was not necessary in all times and places. Still, there is something like men's style and women's style, yes, but depending upon the time and the place that we're looking at, this can be a larger difference or a smaller difference. And in fact, there was quite a lot of physical contact between the sexes in dancing, in Jewish social dancing, in many places. So for example, in a share, which I mentioned before, no one goes into the circle with a handkerchief and says, "Take my handkerchief." We have to say here that as far as we know, as far as we have evidence for this, Jewish musicians played for Jewish weddings and non-Jewish weddings. And so Jews were doing both Jewish dances and non-Jewish dances. And the other non-Jews also liked to do some of the Jewish dances and hear the Jewish melodies as well. But this seems like then everything is just chaos, and it's not. So I want to explain that. So here I would like to repeat something I spoke about last night, which is a very important a theoretical development made by my friend Zev Feldman, Dr. Zev Feldman. And here he's talking about klezmer culture or Yiddish music culture in the area of Bessarabia and also the southern Ukraine. And the question is, or the claim is, that there are 4 categories of repertoire played by klezmer musicians. Okay, the first he calls core repertoire, the center or the core repertoire. And this is music that only had a place in a Jewish social context. For example, in a Jewish wedding, there are sections of the Jewish wedding which have no direct parallel outside of the Jewish wedding. For example, I think Mark mentioned the Kalabazets. And you don't find this music among the other musicians or outside of the Jewish musical world. So then on the other side, let's say this is the most traditional, the most conservative, if you want. On the far end of this is what he calls the cosmopolitan repertoire. For example, for a klezmer musician in Kishinev in 1890, certainly when they played at a wedding, Jewish or non-Jewish, somebody said, "Please play for me Strauss Waltz." Music that was popular in all the urban centers in Europe. And if you're a klezmer musician and you want to work again, you have to play it. It's really like a wedding musician today. You can't say, "I don't play it." To give you a little example of this, I take a step aside from this and I come back. For example, I talked with many musicians like this professional gypsy wedding musicians, and they told me that they would go into the movie theaters and learn the music in the movie, because the next day someone would ask them at the wedding, "Play me the melody, the music from this movie," and they had to be able to do it. So professional wedding musicians have to keep up with whatever music is popular and people ask for. Okay, so we're calling this the cosmopolitan repertoire. The third category he calls co-territorial. We could say it's the music of the neighbors. For example, for musicians in the Ukraine, for Jews loved to dance kolomeyka, but they knew it's not a Jewish dance, it's a Ukrainian dance. Yeah, like today at a Jewish wedding, if someone would say, "I want to dance, I don't know what, rock and roll," okay, something rock and roll, they would dance it, they wouldn't think, "This is Jewish rock and roll." They would just think, "It's rock and roll, and I like dancing it." So this is a repertoire that is a borrowed repertoire, and they understand that this is not Jewish, but we like doing it. And the last category is the most interesting one. This repertoire he calls transitional. And in a transitional repertoire, you have different versions of the same music or of the same dance. And one of those versions, we would say, this is the Jewish version. And the other one would be the Ukrainian or the Moldovan or the Romanian. There are systematic differences. So the Jewish versions tend to be slower. Especially the fast dances are slower. Because if you're gesturing with someone, making communications, you can't, right? If I have a conversation with you, I can speak faster, I can speak a little bit faster, but as soon as I speak fast, you can understand what I'm saying. You can't understand what I'm saying after a certain tempo. So we know, for example, a very good example of this is the Hora that Mark mentioned. The Freilichs has a non-Jewish version of it throughout Moldova and the southern Ukraine. But anyone with some experience, like the ethnographer or the people in this neighborhood, can immediately say, oh, this is Jewish dancing or this is not Jewish dancing. And I'll just finish by saying that not only in the Ukraine, but also this summer, the subject in Weimar, in the workshop, was the relationship between German dancing and Yiddish, or German culture and Yiddish culture. And we took some films and some videos of Jewish dancing to some expert German dance historians and ethnographers. And they said immediately, oh, I know those steps, but I never saw it done that way. And when we asked, what's so different about it? They said, everything that's going on here with the eyes, the upper body, the communication. And this means a lot to me as a musician, because I think this is the essence of Yiddish musical style too. When we play for example, a doina is a kind of a free fantasy kind of genre. Older musicians call this saying a doina, zogen a doina, exactly. So in a way, for Yiddish culture, everything is a kind of talking. And what's beautiful about dance and music is that it's talking without a content, but it's the form of talking.
Thank you. Спасибо.